Because while most people were watching the chaos in the Middle East, while oil prices were spiking and the news cycle was consumed by Iran, something happened in the final week of March 2026 that almost nobody fully understood. And once you see the full picture, you won't be able to unsee it. Putin thought he had found his lifeline. The war in Iran handed him a gift he wasn't supposed to receive. Sanctions were quietly failing. Oil prices were climbing, and Russia was making billions. Billions that were supposed to be impossible. Billions flowing straight into the machine grinding through Ukraine. Putin was sitting back, watching the Persian Gulf burn, watching the money roll in, and he was smiling. And then Ukraine made him stop smiling. In 7 days, just 7 days, Ukraine's drones did something that 3 years of Western sanctions, price caps, financial restrictions, and international diplomatic pressure had completely failed to do. They hit Russia where it actually hurts. Not at the front lines, not in occupied territory, not in some distant battlefield that can be explained away or denied. They hit Russia's money, directly, precisely, repeatedly. And here's what makes this story different from every other Ukraine story you've seen. It's not just the damage, it's the pattern behind the damage. What Ukraine did during those 7 days was not a lucky streak. It was not a series of random strikes. It was a coordinated, calculated campaign targeting an entire economic supply chain. The spine of Russia's oil export economy. And it was executed with a level of strategic sophistication that nobody in Moscow saw coming. By the time the smoke cleared at the end of March 2026, Russia was staring at burning ports, destroyed storage tanks, a crippled refinery network, and an oil revenue figure that had collapsed by hundreds of millions of dollars in a single week. We are going to walk through exactly what happened. Every strike, every number, every domino that fell. And by the end of this, you'll understand why oil and gas analyst Boris Ehrenstein called what Ukraine did the most serious threat to exports of Russian oil since the invasion began in 2022. Stay with me. To understand why the last week of March 2026 was so catastrophic for Russia, you need to understand what was at stake and why Russia thought it was safe. Russia exports oil through a network of major ports and pipelines. Two of the most critical sit on the Baltic Sea, Ust-Luga and Primorsk. These are not minor facilities. These are industrial giants. Ust-Luga processes approximately 700,000 barrels of oil exports every single day. And beyond crude oil, it handles enormous volumes of grains, fertilizers, and coal, making it not just an energy hub, but a critical node in Russia's entire export economy. Primorsk is the oil-specific counterpart, capable of storing 921,000 tons of crude oil and 240,000 tons of petroleum products at peak capacity. Together, these two Baltic Sea ports are responsible for 40% of all of Russia's oil export capacity. 40%. In a war where oil revenue is literally the fuel keeping Putin's military funded and functional, these ports are not peripheral infrastructure. They are the heart of the machine. And Russia thought they were safe. That assumption, that distance, air defenses, and geography made these ports untouchable, is precisely what Ukraine has been quietly, methodically working to disprove. And during one extraordinary 7-day window between March 23rd and March 31st, 2026, it proved it beyond any possible doubt. It started on March 23rd. Ukraine launched what initially appeared to be a series of isolated drone strikes against Primorsk. Multiple explosions, fires breaking out at fuel tanks central to the port's operation, the same tanks that can hold nearly 1 million tons of oil products when fully loaded. Significant damage. Russia scrambled to respond, to contain the fires, to assess what had just happened. If Ukraine had stopped there, that alone would have been a major story. A notable escalation of long-range drone capability. A message sent about Russia's vulnerability. That would have been enough for a week of coverage. Ukraine did not stop there. The next day, drones came again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Rather than a single dramatic strike, Ukraine had opened what amounted to a sustained aerial siege of Russia's most strategically valuable export infrastructure. Day after day, from March 23rd through March 31st, drones traveled hundreds of miles across Russian territory, evading air defenses, or in some cases, simply not encountering them at all, and hit their targets with precision that Russian military planners had not prepared for. By March 29th, the scale of the destruction was becoming impossible to minimize. That day's attack on Ust-Luga alone destroyed 3 fuel storage tanks with a combined capacity of 90,000 tons of oil. Not damaged, destroyed. 90,000 tons of oil burning, along with the ruined shells of the tanks that once held it. Go back to March 25th at the same port. That strike took out 5 fuel storage tanks, another 150,000 tons of oil up in flames, and simultaneously hit 3 Shadow Fleet tankers docked at the port. Then came March 31st, the final punch of the week. A 4th Ukrainian drone strike against Ust-Luga in a single week. Not a follow-up, not an afterthought. A deliberate, repeated demonstration that Ukraine could hit this port whenever it chose, as many times as it chose, and Russia could not stop it. United 24 Media, which tracked the campaign in detail, confirmed that by the end of those 7 days, Russia had been forced to completely halt all oil loading at these ports multiple times. Not once, multiple times. Each halt meant tankers sitting empty. Each halt meant oil that couldn't be loaded, shipped, or sold. And Russia knew that every restart was temporary because Ukraine had clearly established flight paths to these targets. And Russia had spent a full week demonstrating it couldn't intercept the drones using them. The numbers tell the story of the economic devastation with brutal clarity. Start with the tankers. At Primorsk, the standard weekly loading volume is approximately 10 tankers. During the week of hell, only 4 were loaded. That's a 60% decline in loading volume at one port alone. At Ust-Luga, only 2 of a typical 8 tankers were loaded during the same period, an 80% decline. Not a slowdown, not a disruption, an 80% collapse in operational capacity at one of Russia's most critical export facilities. Put those numbers together across both ports and you get the full picture. From a typical export figure of 4.1 million barrels per day, Russia's oil sales tumbled to just 2.3 million barrels. That's 1.8 million barrels per day that weren't being sold, every single day of that week. Now factor in the timing, because the timing is what makes this particularly devastating for Russia's finances. In the weeks before Ukraine's Baltic port campaign, Russia's Urals crude oil price had risen by $11.30, hitting $73.24. A direct result of the chaos in the Strait of Hormuz caused by Iran's blockade during Operation Epic Fury. Putin had been watching oil prices spike and calculating exactly how much extra revenue Russia was about to generate. The math was pointing toward billions in windfall profits that were never supposed to be available under Western sanctions. And then Ukraine stripped away the ability to sell that oil. According to United 24 Media's March 31st report, Russia generated just $1.44 billion in oil revenue for the week ending March 29th. The week before the strikes, when ports were operating normally and elevated prices were flowing through, Russia's oil industry had generated $2.45 billion. In 1 week, Ukraine's drone campaign eliminated over $1 billion in Russian oil revenue. More than $1 billion that the Kremlin cannot tax, cannot spend on soldiers, cannot use to buy shells, drones, or equipment for the war in Ukraine. That is what 7 days of flying sanctions looks like on a balance sheet. To fully appreciate why Ukraine launched this campaign when it did, you need to understand the context of what was happening with conventional Western sanctions. Because that context is the reason Ukraine stopped waiting for someone else to do the job. Western sanctions against Russia are not a failure, but they are not the success they were supposed to be either. The Economics Observatory has documented that between the start of the invasion and August 2025, Western sanctions cost Russia approximately $100 billion in revenue that could no longer be directed toward the war effort. That's a real number. That represents real resources Russia didn't have. But place that $100 billion figure beside this one. In 2024 alone, Russia generated $235 billion from its oil and gas exports. Despite sanctions, despite price caps, despite the most extensive economic pressure campaign mounted against any major economy since the Cold War. Russia, in 2024, generated 0.5% more oil and gas revenue than it did in 2023. It generated only 3.7% less than in 2021, the year before the invasion, when the world wasn't trying to cut it off financially at all. The sanctions were supposed to starve Russia. Instead, Russia was generating hundreds of billions annually, year after year, and directing enormous portions of that money into the military machine, killing Ukrainians every single day. Part of the reason the sanctions have underperformed is the shadow fleet. Russia is believed to have spent well over $14 billion constructing and deploying a network of tankers operating outside Western sanctions frameworks, moving Russian oil through intermediary buyers and obscured supply chains to customers around the world. That fleet moved enormous volumes of oil revenue into Russia that the price cap architecture was never able to effectively intercept. Then came Operation Epic Fury, the joint American-led military operation against Iran. One of its immediate economic consequences was Iran's decision to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. That blockade caused immediate chaos in global energy markets. Oil prices spiked, and among the immediate beneficiaries was Vladimir Putin. The Guardian reported in mid-March that Russia had managed to generate approximately 6 billion euros, roughly $6.93 billion, from fossil fuel sales in just the first 2 weeks of the Iran war. That represented a 14% surge over the same period in February, amounting to approximately 672 million euros in additional revenue that Russia had not been expected to generate. Revenue flowing directly to the Kremlin and directly toward funding the invasion. By the end of March, Business Insider was reporting something even more striking. Russia's oil had gone from trading at a $12 discount to global benchmarks, which is what sanctions and price caps are supposed to produce, to selling at a $4 premium compared to North Sea dated oil. The entire purpose of the price cap mechanism was to force Russia to sell cheap. Instead, geopolitical chaos had flipped the equation and made Russian oil more expensive than standard international benchmarks. And then, because this situation was apparently not complicated enough, the United States temporarily eased some of the sanctions it had implemented against Russia. Not a blanket lifting, not a permanent change, but a general license allowing certain Russian vessels, including oil container ships sailing under the Russian flag, to complete oil unloading operations for cargo loaded before March 12th. The reprieve was valid until April 11th. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron both labeled the measure unnecessary. Macron stated it was in no way justified. Ukrainian President Zelensky was direct. Lifting the sanctions will lead to a strengthening of Russia's position. This easing alone, he said, could provide Russia with about $10 million for the war. That certainly does not help peace. So here was the situation Ukraine found itself in at the end of March 2026. Conventional sanctions generating real but insufficient economic pressure. The war in Iran handing Russia billions in additional oil revenue. The United States temporarily easing sanctions. Russia's shadow fleet continuing to move oil outside the sanctions framework. And Russia's Baltic ports processing shipment after shipment of oil, now selling at a premium rather than a discount. Ukraine's response to that situation was the week of hell. If the tools the West has are insufficient, deploy your own tools. And Ukraine's tools fly, navigate autonomously for hundreds of miles, and hit fuel tanks. Now here's where this story goes from impressive to genuinely extraordinary. Because the Baltic port strikes weren't the full picture. They were the visible part of something much larger happening simultaneously beneath the surface. While the world's attention was on Ust-Luga and Primorsk, and understandably so, given the scale of destruction and the clarity of the economic message, Ukraine was quietly completing a campaign against something even more significant. An entire supply chain, end to end. Ust-Luga and Primorsk, as critical as they are the endpoints of a supply chain. They're where the oil arrives before being loaded onto tankers and shipped to buyers. But the oil that flows through those ports originates in Siberia and travels through a network of pipelines and refineries before it ever reaches the Baltic coast. United 24 has mapped out the specific infrastructure involved. The Siberian oil that feeds Ust-Luga and Primorsk travels through a network including the Druzhba pipeline and two key refineries, Kyryshi Nefteorgsyntez and Yaroslavl. Together, the ports, the pipeline, and the two refineries form a supply chain responsible for 2.6 million of the 9 million barrels Russia claims it can produce every single day. That's nearly a third of Russia's claimed total daily production capacity, concentrated in 5 specific, identifiable, targetable facilities. Ukraine targeted all 5. The Druzhba pipeline had already been shut down since January, not by Ukrainian action, but by the cascading effects of the war. That shutdown was already causing supply problems for Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and other Central European countries that depend on it. One node down. During the same week that the Baltic ports were burning, Ukraine struck the Kyryshi Nefteorgsynthez refinery. The strike was powerful enough to force a complete shutdown of the facility. One of the 2 refineries feeding the Baltic export chain offline. 2 nodes down, plus the pipeline. Then came March 28th. Reports confirmed that the Yaroslavl refinery, the second of the 2 major refineries in the Siberian supply chain, was also in flames following a Ukrainian drone strike. Yaroslavl hit. The refinery shut down. All 5 nodes of the Siberian oil export supply chain, the 2 Baltic ports, the pipeline, and both refineries, simultaneously disrupted, damaged, or completely offline. This was not coincidence. This was not a lucky week of strikes that happened to hit connected targets. This was coordinated, pre-planned, strategically sequenced targeting of an entire economic supply chain from source to export point. And it represents a level of operational sophistication in Ukraine's deep strike campaign that goes well beyond anything we had seen from them previously. The era of isolated strikes against individual Russian infrastructure targets is over. Ukraine has upgraded. It is now targeting entire supply chains, identifying key nodes, sequencing strikes to maximize compounding disruption, and executing with drones that Russian air defenses demonstrably cannot intercept consistently enough to stop the campaign. That upgrade changes the strategic calculus of this war in ways that are still being fully understood. Now let's look at what all of this means economically, because the numbers project forward in ways that should be deeply alarming for the Kremlin. The Atlantic Council confirmed what the port specifications already suggested. Ust-Luga and Primorsk combined handle 40% of all of Russia's export capacity. Not 40% of Baltic exports. 40% of the country's total oil export capacity flows through those 2 ports. We shared that Russia generated $6.93 billion from fossil fuel sales during the first 2 weeks of the Iran war, a period of elevated prices and strong export volumes. If Russia loses 40% of its export capacity because those Baltic ports are too damaged, too disrupted, or too dangerous for tanker captains to approach, that $6.93 billion for 2 weeks becomes approximately $4.16 billion. More than $2.7 billion gone in a 2-week period just from the loss of those 2 ports. Scale it to an annual figure. Russia's 2024 oil and gas revenue was $235 billion. Eliminate 40% of export capacity. Not forever, but for an extended period while repairs are attempted and Ukraine continues to strike. And that $235 billion becomes approximately $141 billion. Russia loses roughly $94 billion annually in oil revenue. To put that in perspective, Western sanctions, 3 years of comprehensive, coordinated, multilateral financial pressure, cost Russia $100 billion in total across that entire period. Ukraine's drone campaign demonstrated in a single week that it can impose comparable economic pressure on an annual basis. With drones, without requiring international coordination, diplomatic negotiation, or enforcement mechanisms. And here's the multiplying factor. Ukraine has clearly demonstrated it can reach these ports whenever it wants. The week of hell featured 4 strikes against Ust-Luga alone in 7 days. Russia had an entire week to respond, to upgrade its air defenses, to intercept the drones, to protect its most economically critical export infrastructure. It failed, which means Ukraine can come back. Not just once, not just occasionally, it can come back as often as it chooses to make these ports effectively unusable. At some point, the question facing tanker operators and their insurers becomes very simple. Is docking at Ust-Luga or Primorsk worth the risk? That calculation doesn't require a direct hit on a tanker. It requires the credible, demonstrated possibility of a hit. which Ukraine has now established comprehensively. Insurance premiums for vessels entering a port that Ukrainian drones struck 4 times in a single week don't just rise, they become prohibitive. The economic disruption extends beyond what the drones can physically destroy to what they make economically impossible for others to attempt. And while all of this is happening to Russia's oil revenue, the broader Russian economy is confirming what these strikes represent as economic pressure. The Central Bank of Russia, the Higher School of Economics, and the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, Russian institutions, not Western ones, are all publishing indicators that the Russian economy has been entering recession since November 2025. This is not Ukrainian propaganda. This is not Western analysis spun to support a particular narrative. These are Russia's own economists and financial institutions describing what is happening to Russia's economic output. And the economy they're describing was already deteriorating. Before Ukraine set fire to 240,000 tons of oil storage capacity in a week. Before 2 refineries went offline. Before tanker loading volumes collapsed by 60% to 80% at the country's most critical export ports. Before over $1 billion in oil revenue evaporated in 7 days. The recession was already coming. Ukraine's flying sanctions are accelerating its arrival and deepening what it looks like when it arrives. Pro-Kremlin economic experts, people whose professional interests are aligned with putting the best possible face on Russia's economic situation, are describing what they see as an economy being brought to its knees. When the people who have every incentive to frame things optimistically are using language like that, the underlying reality is considerably darker than the words they're choosing. Russia now faces a problem with no clean solution. The ports need to be repaired. The refineries need to be restarted. The supply chain needs to be restored. All of that takes time, weeks, realistically months, given the scale of the destruction. And during every week of repair work, Russia is losing the oil revenue those facilities would have generated. But here's the other half of the problem. Russia now knows that Ukraine can strike these facilities again the moment repairs are complete. The flight paths have been established, the targeting data has been gathered, the operational capability has been demonstrated 4 times against Ust-Luga alone in a single week. There is nothing in Russia's current air defense posture that prevented those strikes, and there is no indication that Russia has found a way to close that defensive gap. So Russia faces a choice. Spend months and billions of rubles repairing infrastructure that Ukraine can redestroy the moment it becomes operational. Or accept that these facilities are permanently compromised and adjust its oil export strategy accordingly, which means accepting permanent revenue losses at the scale we've described. Neither option is good. Both are expensive, and Ukraine controls which one Russia has to deal with at any given moment. What began as a week of drone strikes has revealed something about the strategic balance of this war that goes far beyond the strikes themselves. Ukraine has established the capacity to impose economic pain on Russia at a pace and scale that the West's conventional sanctions apparatus has never achieved. And it has demonstrated that Russia's most critical economic infrastructure, the ports and pipelines that turn Siberian oil into war funding, is not protected. In just 7 days, Ukraine changed what this war looks like. Not on the front lines, not in terms of territory, in terms of the economic foundation that has allowed Putin to keep the war going for years, despite every effort to stop him financially. The week of hell ended on March 31st, but what it started, a sustained campaign against Russia's oil export infrastructure, with multiple supply chain nodes targeted simultaneously, executed with drones that Russian air defenses can't reliably intercept, that isn't over. Ukraine has found the lever. The question now is how hard and how consistently it intends to pull it. If this analysis matters to you, subscribe, because we're going to track every development in Ukraine's economic campaign against Russia as it unfolds. Putin thought he had found his lifeline. Ukraine just set it on fire.